Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode. Throughout time, men have sought to invent the most powerful and destructive weapon there is, but none comes close to the atomic bomb. Let's discover together the history of this weapon, which still makes humanity tremble today. August at AM. The first atomic bomb in history explodes above the city of Hiroshima, Japan. This new weapon, invented by the most brilliant scientists of the 20th century, will change the face of the world forever. After approximately seconds of falling, the device is triggered nearly meters above the ground and releases as much energy as tons of TNT. Everything within a km radius is devastated. Most of the wooden buildings are blown away by the explosion. The concrete collapses and the city plunges into apocalyptic chaos. Several tens of thousands of people died instantly, and several tens of thousands more died from their injuries. This is the first time in history that nuclear fire has been unleashed against men. The Japanese, who had ignored the ultimatum posed by Truman on July the same year, were paralyzed. 3 days later, in Nagasaki, a second bomb exploded and destroyed several key factories and facilities, also killing tens of thousands of innocent people. The same day, the Soviets launched an invasion from Manchuria to their Japanese territory. The Empire of the Wind Sun capitulated within a month of its events. In his declaration, Emperor Hirohito announces, "The enemy has deployed a new bomb of extreme cruelty, whose destructive capacity is incalculable and decimates many innocent lives. If we continue to fight, it will not only lead to the collapse and annihilation of the Japanese nation, but also to the complete extinction of human civilization." These two exceptional and already controversial bombings put a spectacular end to the Second World Conflict of the 20th century. For the first time in the history of humanity, the total destruction of the world by fire is contemplated. Stalin, impressed by the power of the first two bombs, ordered his scientists to continue their work. Indeed, even though the global conflict is over, the world is now divided into two blocks, the East and the West, in this Cold War which pits two antagonistic ideologies against each other. Each bloc seeks to extend its influence. In this context, having nuclear weapons is an imperative for the USSR. Soviet spies then infiltrate the Los Alamos Research Center in the United States. Klaus Fuchs, a German recruited by the NKVD, the Soviet Secret Services, transmits vital information to the USSR, while American politicians thought the Soviets needed years to develop the atomic bomb. Only years after the end of the war, the first Soviet nuclear test ended in success. The bomb, which looks exactly like the models launched on Nagasaki, explodes in the steppes of Kazakhstan. From now on, the USSR and the United States are fighting on equal terms, and the race for the biggest bomb is accelerating. The Americans are testing a new model of weapon in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. This device, which looks more like a building than a bomb, is the first to exploit nuclear fusion. This is Ivy Mike. This new bomb technology that uses nuclear fusion can potentially release thousands of times more energy than previously used fission reactions. The Ivy Mike test confirms this theory, and the bomb releases the equivalent of more than 10 million tons of explosives. Unfortunately for the Americans, this machine is absolutely impossible to transport, and it must be miniaturized and rethought its design. It is in this context that Operation Castle takes place. On March 1, 1954, many officials and soldiers flocked to Bikini Atoll. A fleet of decommissioned ships taken from the Germans and Japanese is amassed around the island. Animals are shorn and placed on the water island to measure the effects of radiation on them. Castle Bravo, the bomb which will explode, must release an energy of 5 megatons and constitute a demonstration of force. The boats then move away and put themselves at a good distance from Bikini. The team which must detonate the bomb is sheltered in an anti-atomic bunker. At 6:45 AM, Bravo explodes. A fireball several kilometers in diameter forms in an instant, and the power of the explosion exceeds all predictions. Due to an error in the choice of design materials, the bomb developed not 5, but 15 megatons of power. Everyone who witnesses the explosion feels the intense heat and violent blast of the weapon. The boats are located much too close to the point of impact, and everyone must be sheltered from the fallout. The bunker containing the operators is almost destroyed, and they must be evacuated as quickly as possible. The mushroom, formed by Castle Bravo, rises to an altitude of 14 kilometers and digs a crater 2 kilometers in diameter. The easterly winds cause the raised material, which has become radioactive, to fall back several hundred kilometers, practically opposite the zones planned by the American Army. The residue of the explosion then falls in the form of a fine rain of calcined material. That morning, it was snowing ash in the Pacific. Several inhabited islands are contaminated by this fine radioactive powder. The Americans are trying to evacuate the population as quickly as possible, saying that this situation is only temporary. But it's wrong. Many islands in Atoll become uninhabitable. Their soil is contaminated, their water is unclean, and living organisms are loaded with radioactive material. Even today, these islands are abandoned. This nuclear test is a real health disaster. Several soldiers were contaminated and burned, and the collection of scientific data was almost impossible, the explosion having vaporized most of the measuring devices. Not far from the site of the detonation, a Japanese fishing boat named Dragon Lucky received the full brunt of the radioactive fallout. The crew was contaminated, and Kobayama Aikishi, the ship's radio operator, died of acute radiation syndrome less than 7 months after the Castle Bravo explosion. This incident strains relations between the United States and Japan and raises a wave of distrust against atomic weapons. In terms of power, Castle Bravo is to date the largest bomb the Americans have ever detonated, but it's wrong. Many islands in Atoll become uninhabitable, their soil is contaminated, their water is unclean, and living organisms are loaded with radioactive material. Even today, these islands are abandoned. This nuclear test is a real health disaster. Several soldiers were contaminated and burned, and the collection of scientific data was almost impossible, the explosion having vaporized most of the measuring devices. Not far from the site of the detonation, a Japanese fishing boat named Dragon Lucky received the full brunt of the radioactive fallout. The crew was contaminated, and Kobayama Aikishi, the ship's radio operator, died of acute radiation syndrome less than 7 months after the Castle Bravo explosion. This incident strains relations between the United States and Japan and raises a wave of distrust against atomic weapons. In terms of power, Castle Bravo is to date the largest bomb the Americans have ever detonated, but it is nothing compared to the Tsar Bomba detected by American seismographs on October 30, 1961. At a remote base in northern Russia, a very special nuclear test is about to be carried out. The pilots, handpicked, join their Tupolev-2 aircraft modified for the occasion. The plane is completely waterproof and covered in reflective paint, intended to limit heat absorption. It is relieved of its tanks, and a large hatch under the cabin is intended to transport the twin 7-ton nuclear load. Shortly after 11 a.m., the crew took off and flew to an altitude of 13,000 meters. Above Site C in the Arctic, the pilot drops the bomb. The latter is equipped with a parachute to allow the aviators to escape the blast, and she spends more than 3 minutes in free fall before exploding. Suddenly, the Russian sky lights up. Instantly, a fireball the size of Mount Everest forms, projecting a colossal shock wave that will circle the Earth 3 times before fading. The Tu was nearly destroyed and instantly fell more than a kilometer in altitude. The Tsar Bomba nuclear mushroom cloud measures 64 kilometers high, or 6 times the average altitude of an airliner. A flash of light is visible more than 1,000 kilometers from the point of impact, and the shockwave shatters windows up to 900 kilometers away. In Sverny, an abandoned village located 55 kilometers away, everything is pulverized. At 100 kilometers, the heat still burns at 3rd degree, and the heat wave can be felt more than 300 kilometers away. American scientists are stunned. The USSR has just dropped a 57 megaton bomb, 3,000 times more powerful than the one that hit Hiroshima, and against all odds, it can be transported by plane. This FFF bomb, with fission, was initially supposed to have a power of 100 megatons, but the engineer who designed it, Andrei Sakharov, asked that one of the uranium cells be replaced with lead in order to limit radioactive fallout. Faced with the destruction caused by his creation and the risks of atomic war, Sakharov became one of the fiercest opponents of the nuclear race. In 1968, through pressure, he achieved his first success, which resulted in the signing of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. He then became a fervent defender of freedoms in the USSR, where he was marginalized and then exiled. Sakharov received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1975 and continued his fight until the last day of his life. Several times over the past century, the world has come close to falling into nuclear war. In 1983, a man named Stanislav Petrov avoided the worst. On September 2006, he was an officer on duty in a Soviet base. Its role is simple: to monitor the control screens for the slightest signal of an American nuclear shot. At 12:15 a.m., the alarms were activated, and Petrov saw 1, then 5 signals corresponding to Minuteman I missiles. These orders are clear. He must warn his superiors so that he can launch the atomic response. Stanislav Petrov, however, finds it strange that the USA only launches 5 missiles when they have hundreds at their disposal. Petrov deduces that this is a bug and the counterattack is not triggered. On that night in 1983, the fate of the world rested in the hands of Stanislav Petrov. The atomic bomb is the most frightening weapon ever created, and the only one capable of destroying humanity in the event of war. It was the clock of the 20th century, and is still today the tool of deterrence and threat par excellence. The escalation of tension between the United States and North Korea is, still to this day, a sad example. Today, and despite international agreements, several countries are still looking for the atomic bomb. This is the case of North Korea, which recently successfully tested its first H-bomb, raising tensions between it and the rest of the world. For the little anecdote, know that the bikini swimsuit takes its name from the atoll on which American nuclear tests were carried out. Indeed, the Frenchman who marketed this swimsuit in 1946 wanted to make as much noise with his discovery as the Americans did with their bombs. Its first slogan was the bikini, the first anatomical bomb. In conclusion, know that many scientists who were directly or indirectly associated with the design of the nuclear bomb have become fierce opponents of it. I think first of all of Sakharov, but also of Einstein, who said, I quote, "I don't know how the Third World War will be fought, but I know how the Fourth will be fought, with sticks and stones."